Something that I've had on my mind lately is what life in Venice was like in the early 1500s, when a certain Marco dell'Aquila wrote the music you heard just now, a setting of the popular dance tune La Traditora, the traitress. Exactly who is being betrayed, by whom here, and for what purpose is left to our imagination, but the character of the piece already serves as a window through which to catch a glimpse of Venetian city life. So this episode of Memo expands on last week's topic, the friendship between Marco and one of his clients, a German merchant by the name of Hans Heinrich Herbert, or more specifically, how so many pieces by a musician from Venice ended up in a southern German music collection. It's important to point out that much of the narrative I'm trying to reconstruct here is quite speculative. While we may have some historical evidence, it's not nearly enough to fill out all the gaps in between the reliable bits of information. Even the title of this piece from last week, suggesting a possible friendship between Hans Herbert and Marco, could very well be interpreted stating little more than Hans Herbert simply liking this particular composer. I'd like to thank Pepe Frana and Dr. Afanes for their comments on Facebook, providing some clarification on this topic. What connects the merchant Hans Herbert to Venice is his home, the city of Augsburg, where the patrician family Herbert can be traced from the 20th century back to the 13th. Augsburg was an important center of trade then, basically representing Northern Europe's gateway to trade routes in the south, including Venice. As such, the city was in fact home to several powerful merchant houses, most notably the Fuggers, who became so rich and consequently influential that they would eventually be able to significantly shape the political landscape of early modern Europe as a whole. It was in the 1490s that two of Hans Herbert's great-uncles from Augsburg settled in Venice and entered a joint effort with the Fuggers, aiming to control the Venetian copper trade. And the family kept a foot there in the years to come. The activity of German merchants and their associates was concentrated in a single building, the so-called Fondaco dei Tedeschi by Rialto Bridge, which served as a storehouse, office building and living quarters simultaneously. Over the years, several famous people passed through there, including a traveler from the southern German city of Nuremberg, a certain
Albrecht Dürer. Du Held mit deiner Bande, gefürchtet von den Bösen, geliebt von allen Guten, du Dürer, Albrecht, du, oh Albrecht Dürer, du reiches.
Wir möchten uns für dieses Lied entschuldigen.
Albrecht Dürer wrote several letters back home during his stay in Venice, also mentioning the excellent lute playing he heard there, as well as his work on a large altarpiece commissioned from him by the inconceivably wealthy Jakob Fugger, a work known today as the Feast of the Rosary. Summing up this highly complex painting quickly is nigh impossible, but the central purpose of this commission can easily be understood as a political one, with the foreground figures who flanked the Virgin being Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I facing Pope Julius II. The complexities already begin here though, as the Pope shown doesn't even seem to bear much resemblance to the actual Pope Julius, sworn enemy of the flourishing Venetian Republic. The Feast of the Rosary vouches for concord in a political climate that was tense, to say the least. Dürer accentuates this with a compositional element quite typical for earlier Venetian altarpieces, which is a lute-playing angel, not only implying an oral aspect to the painting, but more importantly, signifying harmony and concord. While the Fondaco's facade may appear unassuming today, one should bear in mind that much of the city's civic architecture state today is a mere shadow of its former self when Venice was in her prime. 2 years after the Feast of the Rosary, Giorgione, a painter you might be familiar with from earlier episodes, was commissioned to decorate the outside of the Fondaco dei Tedeschi with colorful frescoes. due to the lagoon's humid climate, those decorations had been almost completely ruined by the 18th century. Only some highly damaged fragments survive, yet the freshly painted building must have been a sight to behold. Half a century later, humanist Lodovico Dolce recounts a story about its creation in his book on the history of art. How much of this account is merely a tale spun by Dolce is questionable, but anyway, here it is. When Giorgione received the commission to paint the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, he decided to paint the frontal facade himself and, as was common practice, designated one of his students to paint the less prominent sections. This student of his was the 20-year-old Titian. When some Venetians saw his work, they assumed it was his master's and went to Giorgione to congratulate him on his magnificent fresco. Being mistakenly lauded for the work of his young student over his own frustrated Giorgione so much that he locked himself into his house for 3 days and wouldn't come out. That's what Lodovico Dolce writes, at least. In the same year that Albrecht Dürer arrived in Venice, the lutenist Marco dell'Aquila wrote a letter to Venice's council in the Doge's palace. Most serene princess and our most wise council, humbly, the petitioner and servant of your grace, Marco dell'Aquila, from here, who, with the greatest of his ability and at no modest expense, has taught himself to print tablature, and for that reason how to put certain songs to the lute with the greatest ability and art, to the mutual usefulness of various gentlemen and those who delight themselves by sounding the most noble instrument, the lute. And without much outlay of time and his faculties, as such works might never otherwise be printed, may our most illustrious signory be pleased to concede a special privilege to your most faithful aforesaid petitioner. In response, the council granted Marco the privilege to make use of his new invention and print lute music, which would have resulted in the first known print of music specifically for instruments, had it not been for a printer who came to Venice roughly at the same time as the Herwarts and had received the same privilege as Marco, but 7 years earlier, a certain Ottaviano de Petrucci. Only some years prior, he had published the very first book of music printed with movable type, the famous Ottekaton, which represented the starting point for a revolution in the way music was spread. Hundreds of music books were subsequently published all over Europe during the 16th century and reached an audience much larger than what would have been possible through hand-copied manuscripts. Strangely, there are no later accounts on Marco dell'Aquila's endeavor to print lute music that have come down to us. We do have proof, however, that Petrucci must have been quite competitive as a businessman, since there is a later case documented in which he challenged a competitor's privilege and succeeded, forcing him to give up his printing rights. In Marco dell'Aquila's case, we don't know of any such documentation, only that he received a privilege and apparently never made use of it. In a presentation that Paul Odette held on the topic some years ago in Basel, he, perhaps half-jokingly, suggested that the strange circumstances and lack of documentation potentially point to an interpretation of the story that is a little more sinister. Do I smell a new movie plot here? In this context, it hardly seems like a coincidence that Petrucci published the first printed book of lute music a mere 2 years later, a volume containing compositions by a certain Francesco Bini. A lutenist who, judging by the sources that we have, or rather don't have, doesn't seem to have enjoyed a higher standing than Marco dell'Aquila or some of his contemporaries. Did Marco's acquisition of the printing privilege perhaps pressure Petrucci into simply printing music of the first lutenist he could get his hands on, just to make sure he did so before anyone else? Regardless, the print helped Spinacino's pieces to spread and eventually survive the centuries safely stored in libraries to this day. Meanwhile, it is only thanks to Marco's apparent connections to the merchants of the Fondaco dei Tedeschi that we have remnants of his music at all, preserved in the lute manuscript of Hans Heinrich Herwarth. Covering the music contained in Ottaviano de Petrucci's first lute print is already on my agenda for an upcoming episode of my weekly show Memo. Though for next week I have a special feature planned. There will be a guest here in the studio who will present some of her unique research and of course also play some music for us on an original and rare instrument from the 18th century. If you wouldn't want to miss that, you could, as always, subscribe right here on YouTube, Facebook or Instagram. The links are down there. And if you happen to have a question you would like me to address in an upcoming video, don't hesitate to post a comment and I'll try to answer it to the best of my abilities. So, see you next Friday and until then,